and today I will be talking about a small kingdom, the kingdom of Commageni, and how these the kings created and transformed their dynastic. So before I begin though, it might be necessary to begin by making a brief presentation of what Commageni was and who these kings were. Commageni is situated between the Taurus, the Amanus and the Euphrates. One hesitates to say that it was hemmed in by these geographical features, since it was to these that the small kingdom owed in times of peace its prosperity and in times of hardship its survival. To the west lay Cilicia, to the north Cappadocia, to the east Sophene and Armenia, a land that, as we shall see, has a great importance, and to the south Mesopotamia and Syria, where the Seleucids held sway. We do not know much about the history of the region before the 2nd century BC, but we do know that in 163 BC, the governor of the region, Ptolemaios, chose to renounce the allegiance to his masters, the Seleucids, and set himself up as an independent ruler. He was succeeded in about 130 by his son, Samos, who consolidated the kingdom and founded, or refounded, as the common practice went, what was to become the capital of the kingdom, Samosata. And you see here a beautiful illustration from the 19th century. This is a period of great turmoil in the area, and Samos's prosperity is a testament to his diplomatic ability. In 96 BC, it was time for his son, Mithridates I, to take up the crown. He was married to a Seleucid princess, Laodike, and that was in effect a certificate of nobility, and it seemed that the Commagenian dynasty had reached the peak of respectability among the royal houses of the age. But not before long, the remnants of the Seleucid kingdom were taken over by the greatest king of the Armenians, Tigranes the Great. In 70 BC, Mithridates died and left the crown to his son, Antiochus I. This was the age of the Titanic conflict between Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, Tigranes, king of Armenia, and Rome. On the way to battle the Armenian king, the legions of the Republic received the allegiance of the Commagenian ruler, who was apparently all too happy to be relieved of his fealty to Tigranes. Not long afterwards, however, the same Antiochus would be besieged by Pompeius, who was determined to mold the region according to his vision of the eastern frontier. When he died in 36 BC, Antiochus left behind him not only a prosperous kingdom, but also a magnificent monument, the Hierotesion of Nemrudda, of which more will be said later. Other kings followed upon the Commagenian throne until 17 AD. Upon the death of Gaius Julius Antiochus III, the region was transformed into a Roman province. Though the empire treated the heirs of the dynasty with all due respect, thus Antiochus IV, of whom we have a portrait here, befriended Caligula, and was for a brief period of time reinstated as a king of his ancestral domain. His favor was withdrawn for unknown reasons, but granted to him again when the next emperor, Claudius, came to power. When Vespasian came to be emperor of Rome, Antiochus saw himself deposed once again. His descendants lived in wealth and honor, being integrated in the Roman aristocracy. His nephew, for example, Philopappos, would live to be consul under the rule of Trajan and would commemorate his activity in another crucial monument for this paper, the grandiose tomb in Athens. It is thus in the two great monuments that the kings of Commageni chose to inscribe their dynastic myth, the Hierotesion at Nemrut and the tomb of Philopappos in Athens. Their comparison will, I believe, yield interesting information about how dynasty made and transformed its identity in the course of time. Both of these monuments are actually monumental tombs, and both use sculpture and inscriptions to identify and describe the ancestors of the interred king, informing the audience, the Commagenian subjects in one case, and the Athenian contemporary co-citizens in the other, about the way in which they perceive their ancestry and consequently themselves. We can now see an overview of the monument at Nemrut. The list of ancestors on this monument starts with Darius the Great and lists former Persian kings: Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Darius II, and Artaxerxes II. Next in line is the satrap Aroandes, generally known from Greek sources as Orontes, and there follow a number of other satraps of Sophene. The first proper ruler of Commagenian is also named Ptolemaios, who is in turn followed by his son Samos, by his grandson Mithridates, and by his grandson Mithridates Kallinikos. Kallinikos is honored throughout the Nemrut-Da complex as the father of Antiochus I Theos, and with him ends the line of his paternal ancestors. On his mother's side, Antiochus wished to pay homage first and foremost to Alexander the Great, then to Seleukos Nicator, Antiochus I Soter, Antiochus II, and other Seleucid kings. The visual setting of these two lists is symptomatic for the dynastic conception of the Commagenian king, for the two are presented in parallel lines, facing each other over the causeway, and being given therefore equal weight. The king is careful to underline this also in writing, for while referring to the Greek and Persian traditions, he calls them the most fortunate roots of my family. This balanced vision, or at the very least this balanced public statement, is discarded in later phases of the dynasty. For Gaius Julius Antiochus Philopappus chose to be represented on his Athenian funerary monument in the company of just two male ancestors, identified in the inscriptions as King Antiochus, son of King Antiochus, which probably refers to Antiochus IV, his grandfather, and the other one being King Seleukos Nicator, son of Antiochus. Two ancestors stand out by their conspicuous absence. One of them is Darius, the other one is Alexander. It would be hard to believe their absence is due to ignorance on the part of Philopappus, so perhaps it would be better to seek an explanation through the political context of the day. Due to the fact that the Emperor Trajan in this monument is named Optimus, but has only two martial titles, Dacicus and Germanicus, the monument must have built between 114 and 116 AD. At the time, the emperor was waging a successful but nevertheless taxing war against the Parthians and the eastern rivals of Rome in much of the Achaemenid tradition, and therefore, had Philopappus placed on his tomb an inscription honoring Darius, he would have certainly been accused of open Parthian sympathies. Another hypothesis, less attractive though, is that the dynast was mindful of Athenian sensitivities, since Darius had been, after all, one of the great enemies of the city. It is doubtful, however, that the Median Wars still represented an issue in contemporary Athens, with enough political significance to make a dynast reassess his dynastic origins. The omission of Alexander has probably been prompted by the status of the Macedonian king in the High Imperial Age. From a symbol of the despotic monarch, we see him in Seneca, he became the epitome of the virtuous king, who treasures education and who can be successfully used as a role model for a Roman emperor. At last, there are, these are the main coordinates along which his image is constructed in Dion Chrysostom's series of speeches, Peribasileias, about kingship. Moreover, it is known that Trajan himself sought to imitate Alexander. It is therefore not improbable that claiming descent from the great Macedonian king in that political context would have been assimilated to putting forward ambitious political claims. Great differences therefore to be noted between the dynastic representations of these two representatives of the Commagenian house. If Antiochus I portrayed himself as great as he could through the magnifying glass of his ancestry, Gaius Julius Antiochus Philopappus portrayed himself as great as he could without attracting the wrath of the truly great people of his age, in particular Trajan. As seen from all the above, the dynastic conception of the royal house under scrutiny is not static as an immutable truth, but rather fluid, adapting itself to suit the needs of the day, that is, attracting positive responses from an increasingly diverse audience. Given the sometimes very detailed character of the genealogies put forward, one must naturally wonder what the source was for such reconstructions, whether it was oral history that we no longer possess traces of, internal dynastic narrative, or even Greek written sources. It is unfortunate that we do not possess examples of aristocratic genealogies, apart from those of the royal houses, But this alone, coupled with the numerous attestations of Iranian names along the aristocracy, is enough to stand as proof that Persian descent was prestigious. It's hard to tell to what extent the written sources have influenced the image of the royal houses, but it is relatively easy to point that there must have been an independent dynastic tradition, given the differences in names that sometimes appear. For example, the example that we have quoted, the Aroandes, that is named in the inscription, which is notably different from what the standard Greek version is, Orontes. As often happens in politics, merely generating a set of ideas or representations is never enough. These ideas need to be conveyed to the community in such ways as to be at the same time comprehensible and acceptable. And we possess little evidence for the way in which the dynasties advertise their descent to their own subjects, but these bits and pieces deserve further analysis. I shall not bother you with the details of the imitation of the ancestors, because this subject has already been touched upon, so I will jump straight to the artistic representations. The architectural complex at Nemrudağ is a very interesting illustration of the architectural eclecticism. The general design gravitates physically and symbolically around the central mount, which forms in effect the mountaintop, and it is well known that Persian kings were said to offer sacrifice in such dramatic spots. Yet the arrangement of the different items that form the complex has been determined after painstaking calculations inspired by astrology, itself a field of knowledge that resulted from the osmosis of Oriental and Hellenic influences. The same process is at work in the creation of statues that adorn the monument.